What I'm about to tell you actually happened. Imagine walking into a place you've never been before and being treated like someone everyone already knows. People greet you, they hug you, some even kiss you. Not because you're famous, not because you've been there before, but because they think you're someone else.
It was a sunny autumn day in 1980. For 19-year-old Bobby, everything had started out completely ordinary. It was his first day at SUNY Sullivan College in New York, and the moment he stepped onto campus, he was met with attention he did not expect. Male students greeted him as if they already knew him, asking how his summer vacation had been. Female students approached him without hesitation, hugging him around the neck, and some even kissed him. To be honest, Bobby was not bothered by this. He had not even met anyone yet. As he wandered aimlessly around the campus, he assumed this unusual friendliness was simply a school tradition. But just a few minutes later, a single moment would change the direction of his life forever. Someone calling out to him from behind using a different name made Bobby feel uneasy, because the name he heard was Eddie, but the person who had just started school that day was not Eddie. It was Robert Bobby Shafran. So who was Eddie? Bobby had been born on July 12, 1961 at Long Island Jewish Hospital in Queens, New York. Through an adoption process run by Louise Wise Services, he became a member of the Shafran family. His family lived in Scarsdale, an affluent area north of Manhattan. His father, Morton Shafran, was a well-known doctor, and his mother was a lawyer. Bobby had always known he was adopted, just like his sister. However, until starting college, he had never felt any curiosity about his biological family and had lived his life without questioning this fact. Until that day when everything changed. There was someone at the school who was watching Bobby closely. This student, who was Eddie's roommate, noticed the similarities in Bobby's facial features. The same hairline, the same expressions, the same body language. The resemblance was too obvious to be a coincidence. Learning that Bobby was adopted only strengthened his suspicions. The possibility that was raised began to echo in Bobby's mind. Maybe he had a twin. The phone call that followed this thought changed everything beyond repair. The moment Bobby heard Eddie's voice on the other end of the line, he noticed the similarity in the very first words, because the voice he heard was almost identical to his own. The person on the phone was Edward Galland Eddie. He too had been born on July 12, 1961 in Queens, New York. He had been adopted by a middle-class, conservative family living on Long Island. Just like Bobby, he also had an adopted sister. His father, Elliot Galland, was a teacher known for his strict discipline. For Eddie, this phone call revealed one of the most shocking truths of his life as well, because it became clear that both young men had been placed with their families through the same adoption agency, Louise Wise Services. Their first meeting was a scene that is hard to describe with words. They were meeting for the first time, yet there was no sense of unfamiliarity between them. The same face, the same posture, the same smile, and the same chubby hands. The truth was now impossible to deny. They were twins, and for 19 years they had lived completely unaware of each other's existence. If this encounter had never happened, they might have gone their entire lives without ever learning the truth. This extraordinary story quickly attracted the attention of the media. Newspapers, television shows, interviews. Bobby and Eddie suddenly became known across the country. But the real turning point of the story would come with the photographs published in the newspapers. When a woman named Ellen Nussbaum saw these photos, she froze, because the faces she was looking at looked incredibly similar to her close friend, David Kellman. The round facial features, the large hands, and that cheerful smile. The resemblance was disturbing. When David Kellman first looked at the newspaper, he thought it was just a simple coincidence. After all, people could look alike. But as he continued reading the details of the article, an indescribable uneasiness took over. Every single detail matched his own life. Being adopted, his date of birth, the hospital where he was born. Even the adoption agency was the same. From this point on, there was no longer any doubt, only an unavoidable truth. Bobby and Eddie did not know it yet, but the story did not end there. because they were not twins. They were triplets. So David picked up the phone and called Eddie's house. When Eddie's mother answered, he told her that he had seen the twins in the newspaper and then added one sentence. "I think there is a third brother, and that brother is me." The moment she heard these words, the phone slipped from the woman's hand, because her adopted son had just learned at the age of 19 that he had a twin. And now, only days later, another brother had appeared. These young men, who had believed their entire lives that they were only children or at most had one sibling, had suddenly learned that they were triplets. When the triplets finally met, it was as if they were trying to make up for all the years they had lost. In fact, their behavior gave the impression that they had known each other for a long time. They joked, laughed loudly, wrestled on the floor, and ran from one room to another. 3 separate lives had become a single whole again. They moved the same way, laughed at the same things, and wanted to go to the same places. It was as if one consciousness had been divided into 3 bodies and had finally reunited after years apart. From that moment on, they had no intention of separating. They went out together at night, slept together, traveled together, and ate together. What the future would bring and what dark truths lay hidden in this story was not yet on anyone's mind. There were questions, but the answers were postponed for now. What began as a lost twin reunion drew even greater media attention once it was revealed that they were triplets. They appeared on television shows, made newspaper headlines, and quickly became nationally recognized figures. People could not get enough of this story, because a story that began with pain was continuing in an unexpected way with hope and happiness. They said they were attracted to the same type of women, liked the same colors, and even smoked the same brand of cigarettes. Despite growing up in different families and under different conditions, it was clear that their genetic bond had shaped their personalities in astonishingly similar ways. However, there was an important detail behind these similarities. All 3 had grown up in completely different social classes. David, the last one to be found, had grown up in a working-class, blue-collar family. Eddie's family belonged to the middle class, with traditional and conservative values. Bobby, unlike the others, had grown up in a financially comfortable and wealthy family. But the most surprising details did not end there. Among the 3, the one who had the warmest and most lively father figure was David. They had nicknamed his father Bubala. This Yiddish word, which expresses love, affection, and closeness, seemed to perfectly describe his character. When David's father learned that his son had 2 identical brothers, he did not treat them like strangers, but like his own children. He spent time with the other 2 brothers and treated them the same way he treated his son. In contrast, the reactions of the other families were more restrained and distant. The parents of the triplets requested a meeting with the adoption agency that had placed their children when they were 6 months old. Their goal was simple: to learn why the siblings had been separated. The agency officials stated that they had made this decision because they believed it would be very difficult for a single family to adopt all 3 children at the same time. However, this explanation never satisfied the families, because something was missing. Moreover, it appeared that the agency had deliberately prevented the siblings from knowing about each other. There was something strange about this, and it could no longer be denied. The fact that these 3 children had been deliberately separated suggested that this story had a much darker side, one that had not yet been told, and the real truth had still not come to light. From this point on, it was only a matter of time before the triplets reached the truth. When the birth records at the New York Public Library were examined, it was not difficult to find the information of a woman who had given birth to triplets on July 12, 1961. The records pointed to a single name, a woman who carried the traces of a mistake made at a young age for the rest of her life. The mother had paid the price of a decision she made at the age of just 19, on a prom night, under the influence of alcohol perhaps, for her entire life. There was a disturbing gap in the story. Some people still could not stop asking the same question. All right, but why? Why were these children separated from each other? Why did no one tell them the truth? This silence was broken nearly 10 years later. In the mid-1990s, journalist Lawrence Wright reopened the case, suspecting that there might be much more beneath this extraordinary story. What initially looked like a story of fate could, in fact, be hiding a disturbing system. During his research, Wright came across several academic papers published in the field of psychology. These studies described long-term experiments conducted on twins and triplets who had been separated from each other and raised without knowing of one another's existence. And as Wright examined the details more closely, a chilling similarity began to emerge. The triplet babies mentioned in these experiments had been placed with different families through an adoption agency in New York. At this point, there was no longer any doubt. The triplets being referred to were Bobby, Eddie, and David. From here on, everything began to unravel for Lawrence Wright like a pulled thread. The truth was emerging slowly, but with great force. These three brothers had not been separated by a twist of fate. They had been subjects of a secret scientific experiment conducted in the field of psychology. They had been deliberately separated, deliberately placed into families from different socioeconomic backgrounds. The goal was to answer one question: nature or nurture? What's more, the clues had been there from the very beginning. People regularly visited the triplets' homes on behalf of the adoption agency. They observed the children, took notes, and occasionally recorded them on camera. The families were told that this was a routine procedure meant to monitor the development of adopted children. No one knew the true purpose of these visits. In reality, while the three brothers were growing up completely unaware of each other within a radius of approximately 160 kilometers, the adoption agency Louise Wise Services was tracking their every move. The agency kept detailed reports on all three and used this data as part of a psychological research project. At the center of this research was Peter B. Neubauer. An Austrian-born child psychiatrist, Neubauer had become one of the most influential child psychologists in the United States by the 1960s. One of the most heated debates of the era, whether personality is shaped by innate traits or by upbringing, was his primary area of interest. But what set Neubauer apart from others was that he conducted secret experiments to test his theories. Neubauer had established a behind-the-scenes collaboration with Louise Wise Services, one of the largest adoption agencies in the United States. According to this arrangement, whenever identical twins or triplets were to be placed for adoption, Neubauer was informed, and the selection of families was made either directly or indirectly by him. These children were then followed for years by researchers working for Neubauer, and detailed reports were compiled. When the issue of finding families for the triplets came up in 1961, Neubauer did not miss this opportunity. In fact, this situation offered an experimental field even more valuable than identical twins. The priority was not the well-being of the children, but the experiment itself. But time reveals everything. First two of them, then the third. Whether you call it fate or chance, these brothers somehow found each other. And in the 1990s, the research conducted by Lawrence Wright exposed this entire dark structure through his article published in The New Yorker. However, this revelation was not enough to explain the whole truth. The experiment was never officially published, and the data obtained was never shared with the public. It was announced that the documents, videos, audio recordings, and reports related to this study were stored in the Yale University Sterling Library archives and would remain closed to access until the year 2065. Even the people who were part of the experiment were not allowed to access them. In academic circles, it is believed that these documents contain major ethical and legal scandals and serious violations. In fact, the purpose of the experiment was deeper than it seemed. The clues that emerged suggested that the researchers were not satisfied with simply comparing children raised in different environments. It was also believed that children whose biological parents had psychological disorders were deliberately selected, and that these predispositions emerged under different living conditions. In other words, the children may have been monitored not only based on which home they grew up in, but also based on the invisible risks they carried. And indeed, this was one of the main areas of interest of Peter B. Neubauer. This deliberate separation was not merely a cold scientific choice made in the name of science. Over time, it triggered various psychological problems in the siblings who had been torn apart. In fact, this is exactly what happened to David, Eddie, and Bobby. The three brothers opened a restaurant in New York called Triplets, and at first everything was going great. The restaurant quickly became very popular. However, Bobby soon left the partnership and decided to study law. This separation seriously damaged the bond between the brothers. Eddie, who had grown up in a middle-class family, was emotionally the most fragile. From the outside, he appeared to be a happy E, but suppressed psychological issues and the impact of an authoritarian father figure from his childhood had left deep scars. Bobby's departure placed heavy pressure on Eddie, and over time, his symptoms of manic depression became more severe. As time passed, Eddie's condition worsened. He was hospitalized and treated, but recovery was not possible. In 1995, at the age of 34, he took his own life due to the long-standing mental health issues he had been battling. Today, Bobby Shafran works as a lawyer in Brooklyn and is a father of two. David Kellman works in the insurance industry in New Jersey and also has two children. They continue their lives now not as three, but as two. In reality, this story shows the ethical limits of science. I don't know about you, but separating siblings deliberately for the sake of a scientific experiment goes against my values. What's more, the names of those involved in the experiment are still kept secret. Maybe there are people who live for years without knowing they had a sibling. Maybe one day you could run into your twin on the street. If you enjoy true stories like this, consider subscribing.
The Dark Vault. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon for more awesome content.